um, hello. Wait, are we? Oh yeah, no, 1 second. Hello everyone, welcome to the stream. Um, well, here's hoping this isn't a case of copyright claim. I mean, I've seen it on YouTube. But who knows? Might have to do this as a recording later. But anyway, my GoFundMe is down below. If you want to make a donation, go ahead. Anyway, let's get started. Oh, and that's a beautiful shot.
In this place, there once stood a city. The most famous city in the world. A city whose tragic fate has inspired poets and artists for 3,000 years. A city whose memory will far outlive the last trace of its physical existence. A city called Troy.
Ilium.
But what happened here? What lies beneath the legend of the Trojan War?
Very nice, the horned helmet. I don't know who Michael Wood is.
The story as we know it is told by the poet Homer, who may have lived around 700 BC, 500 years after the war was supposed to have taken place. It has been retold over the centuries. It is a tale of love and war. Long ago, a prince of Troy, Paris, eloped with a Greek queen, Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world.
He straight up abducted her.
Where his father Priam was king. The Greeks followed with 1,000 ships to take revenge. Their leader was Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, rich in gold. For 10 years they fought in the plain before the city. The heroes of both sides were killed. The Greek Achilles, the gallant Trojan Hector. The city was finally entered by the famous trick of the wooden horse, inside which the Greeks hid armed men. Troy was burned, its people slaughtered, sharing the fate of all victims of war.
What am I even looking at here? Oh, okay then. This, oh yeah, it must be World War II.
Berlin, February 1945.
What?
Here took place what is so far the last...
Oh, right. Heinrich Schliemann, a German man, discovered Troy.
And here, 40 years on, my search started. Berlin had been famous for the arts of civilization. Its museum buildings, now scarred or gutted by the fires of war, had been the greatest center of classical scholarship in the 19th century. Here, the rediscovery of Homer and the beginnings of archaeology had gone hand in hand. That November day, I went to the Charlottenburg Museum in West Berlin, drawn as so many are by the lure of the man who, it is commonly said, discovered Troy. Heinrich Schliemann, father of archaeology, genius, romantic, liar. No one is sure how to take him nowadays. In 1886, 4 years before he died, Schliemann gave his Trojan finds, including a priceless gold treasure, to the Berlin Museum. Here it was displayed until the Second World War.
That's very difficult to say.
And that afternoon, Dr. Klaus Goldman showed me the remnants from Troy, which survived 1945. After the rain of bombs, German archaeologists had to excavate these things a second time from the debris of their own museum. The gold alone escaped, but has never been seen since. Only replicas remain.
So these are copies of the actual gold pieces
Yes,
that
yes.
Schliemann found at Troy in the 70s?
Absolutely, yes. Copies of the gold objects who are missed from World War II on.
And the originals are...
Nobody knows.
Nobody knows. Isn't that always the case?
To fight to save these fragments, when our own civilization is in ruins around us, is to make a statement of faith in the
Whoa,
achievements
what
of
the?
humankind, however small.
What happened to me there?
Preserve even a single piece of plot for what it may tell future generations. Carefully painted by a Bronze Age Greek before it was traded to Troy. Perhaps then the Greeks and Trojans had even been friends.
Most people who fight wars can be the best friends several years later.
Or before.
Or before,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
Right.
And the fire marks on them, you don't know whether it's the Second World War or the Trojan War.
Maybe the Second World War.
These all too human artifacts, with their burn marks separated by 3,000 or 4,000 years, were found in the ruins of a real place, which we now call Troy. And what of the man who found them, now commonly branded as a crook, Schliemann himself?
He was one of the greatest archaeologists because nobody did believe that Troy has been a real place in history. And Schliemann did believe it, excavated the place that was Troy in historic times too, and so he, I think, opened a new chapter in history, in archaeology. He was a very great man.
That day in Berlin, it seemed, the Troy story was part of the cruel and remorseless march of history, not a fairy tale but a real story with real people. It was almost as if ghosts were waiting to be summoned. And Schliemann would only be the first. In this series there are many chapters, which will lead from Berlin to Troy and Mycenae, across Europe from Ireland to Armenia, and eventually back to Berlin. A search in which major discoveries have been made in the last few months. Each generation of archaeologists has made a different version of the tale of Troy. But is the tale true? To even attempt to find answers, the first step had to be Schliemann. He defined the search, inspired the generations who came after him with his romantic faith in the truth of Homer's Iliad.
I've read the Iliad. It's a very good read.
His obsession with Troy started, he claimed, with this picture in a book given by his father at Christmas 1830 when he was 8. Its childlike vision of the Trojan tragedy, he said, made finding the city the goal of his life. All he did later was to that end. A business career which took him from the California gold rush to the Crimean War and made him $1 million by the time he was 30. Even his love life became a step towards that ultimate goal of proving Homer true in his second marriage to the 16-year-old Sophie, a Greek girl who knew her Homer and who would accompany him on his quest. Schliemann has sold us all his fairy tale.
The people who knew him are completely divided over his character. Some of them thought him the cheeriest of beings, kindly, always ready for new facts. Others said he was dogmatic, devious, and even a liar and a cheat. He himself, retrospectively, liked to think of himself as solitary, driven, romantic figure with Troy as his ultimate goal. And yet, in all the 60,000 letters and papers that survive of his, there is no mention of the Trojan obsession until he reaches the age of 46. And then he seems to have wanted to get out of business and into some sort of scientific field. What he didn't know, and in fact he thought it was probably too late, but he enrolled as a mature student in Paris. And he enrolled in a subject, a new science in which an amateur could possibly make a mark. A new science engendered by a dramatic change in people's attitude to the past. Archaeology.
So where are we now? Oh.
At that moment, 1859, the publication of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species signaled a scientific revolution, not only in geology and natural history, but also in human history. The Bible could no longer contain the answers to man's past. A vast and mysterious prehistory lay waiting to be uncovered by the spade.
Okay, so what museum was that?
But where did the new science stand when Schliemann began? To find out, I went to Cambridge to ask the professor of archaeology there, Colin Renfrew.
When Schliemann began his work in Greece, it only was 10 or 15 years since the antiquity of man had been established, and one usually thinks that happened in about 1859. And up to that time, really, the biblical view was followed that the world was created in 7 days, and some scholars have calculated that to be in the year 4004 BC. But it wasn't really a prehistory you could speak of. And the word prehistory wasn't invented until about 1865. So it's all the time that Schliemann was young, but the time that Schliemann was on the brink of starting his work, the following decade, in fact, in Greece. Of course, he was criticised by some of the professional scholars who didn't approve of this amateur coming into the field, but I'm sure in many ways he was as good as they were, and he was certainly opening up this entirely new field, so he stands as a towering figure, whereas most of them are forgotten.
But where would Schliemann look for his Troy? In fact, he owed the idea which brought him world fame to a now forgotten figure who literally told him where to dig. An elusive Englishman whose shadowy face peers from indistinct photographs. Frank Calvert, United States Consul in northwestern Turkey, knew the region's history better than anyone. It was Calvert who persuaded Schliemann to try to prove the existence of Homer's Troy by excavation. Early in 1870, this middle-aged retired businessman arrived in Istanbul, then the capital of Turkey.
Wouldn't that be in the Ottoman Empire? Well, it would have been called Turkey, so what am I saying?
Schliemann was about to engage in the riskiest speculation of his life. From Istanbul, he sailed through the Sea of Marmara to the Dardanelles. There, in the northeastern corner of the Aegean Sea, was It's believed to be the site of Homer's Troy. That April, he entered Homer's swift-flowing Hellespont, and from now on, Homer would be his guidebook. Following in his footsteps, it was easy to feel his excitement. Now, he wrote, I hope finally to resolve the great riddle as to where Troy was. The age of archaeology was about to begin. Chanaku in Asia. Since medieval times, Western travelers had come through here looking for Troy. French, Venetian, English, all had walked these streets, Homer in hand, under the gaze of amused locals, buying provisions, hiring transport and guides, before heading south in search of Troy. The exact site of the lost city had long been the subject of furious controversy. Its general location, though, had never been in any doubt, somewhere above the flat green plain at the mouth of the Dardanelles. In the ancient world, it was believed that Homer's Troy lay under a little Roman town called New Ilium, which stood at the end of a long ridge, pointing down the plain towards the sea. In modern times, this idea had fallen out of favor, but here at a hill called Hissarlik, Frank Calvert had dug and found deep remains below the Roman foundations. This was where he persuaded Schliemann to look for Troy. And in 1870, this was where Schliemann came.
Oh, jeez.
In this place, the ancients believed Troy had stood. Here, one said, no stone is without a name. I confess, wrote Schliemann, that I could hardly control my emotions when I saw it. Its image had haunted my childhood dreams. But did Helen stand on these walls and watch the heroes die for her? Did Achilles drag dead Hector here in the dust? The wooden horse bring down on the city a whirlwind of doom. I was convinced this was the place, wrote Schliemann. Iliad in hand I sat and imagined the armies marching to and fro in the plain. The fleet, the camp, the fortress of Troy on Hissarlik. For 2 hours the events of the Iliad passed before my eyes, until hunger and darkness forced me to leave. But did Troy ever exist in reality? And did it stand here? Schliemann first put spade into Hissarlik in April 1870. The hill was about 700 feet square, 130 feet above the plain. Calvert had told him that the hill was largely composed of debris, in layer upon layer up to 50 feet deep. So, assuming Homer's Troy must be deep down near the bedrock, Schliemann decided on a simple but brutal method of finding it.
From the beginning,
TNT.
Frank Calvert counselled Schliemann to go carefully and dig a network of small trenches, but convinced that Homer's Troy must lie deep inside the hill, Schliemann attacked it with sometimes over 100 workmen, armed with the best English pickaxes, wheelbarrows, windlasses, chains and battering rams, to drive a terrific hole into Hissarlik. And this is Schliemann's great trench today, like a bomb site. You can still walk up it right into the heart of the mound without encountering any architectural detail at all. Architectural detail there was, though. He describes a prehistoric building that he found 20 feet deep with 10 feet high walls made of squared blocks of limestone, beautifully smooth, all of which he destroyed. But searching for a Troy that looked like Homer's Troy, Schliemann pressed on deeper into Hissarlik.
In the course of 3 seasons, Schliemann succeeded in identifying 4 main cities superimposed one upon the other below the road. But Homer's city did not appear to be among them. What pottery he found was weird and primitive. Strange 2-handled cups were the nearest he could see to anything Homer mentioned. But these were gritty clay, not silver or gold. The deeper he dug, the more his worst fears grew. Perhaps Troy is not here after all, he confided to his diary. There, deep in the marl, 30 feet below the Roman city, he came across the ruins of a prehistoric citadel. It had a paved ramp leading up to a gate set in a massive fortification wall. Perhaps he thought this was Homer's Scaean gate, through which Hector had spurred his chariot down from Priam's palace. The place was tiny, only 100 yards across, but it lay covered in a mass of charred debris. It had been destroyed by war. If the city had existed, then this must be it. Schliemann announced to the world that he had found Homer's Troy. Troy is not large, he said, but Homer is an epic poet, not a historian. He had never seen it. But Hissarlik is the site of the citadel of Priam. I have opened up a new world for archaeology.
Yeah. I've actually never seen this before. It's quite interesting.
Publicly applauded, Schliemann was privately unhappy. After long searching, he wrote, "I admit I have not succeeded in making the vast deposits of debris agree with historical chronology. And now, with hindsight, we can see why. With the aid of computer technology, let's put ourselves in Schliemann's shoes. There was a logic to the way he had tackled the hill."
He'd read the classical sources very carefully indeed. The tradition, as we've seen, was that the Roman city of Ilium, the Greek city of Ilion, over whose location there'd never been any doubt, stood on the site of Homer's Troy. So Schliemann could expect near the top of the mound to find the ruins of a Roman city. And that's exactly what he had. There's in yellow is the great city wall of Ilium and the temple precinct visited by, among others, Julius Caesar and Constantine. Below that, he thought there would be a Greek city, the one visited by Alexander the Great and the Persian Emperor Xerxes. And again he had it. He demolished its northern circuit as he went through. Below that, he expected to find what he called a Lydian city from Homer's own lifetime. In fact, there were 2 main phases to this, and Schliemann had very little idea of what this was really about. And he demolished its northern circuit. But if the logic of the sequences in the ancient sources was right, then below these ought to be Homer's Troy. And sure enough, he came upon the greatest of the prehistoric settlements, Troy too. Tiny as it was, that was the one, as we've seen, that he thought was Homer's. So it would be wrong to think that he was engaging in pure fantasy. He had worked it out as far as his evidence permitted, and that is without pottery to make the dating secure. But when you consider what we now know about this site, its incredible maze of ruins, over 50 layers, making up 9 major settlements going back over 5,000 years of human habitation. It helps us to understand why poor old Schliemann found such difficulty in untangling the mysteries of Hisarlik.
Interesting. Oh, that's a beautiful shot.
By 1873, Schliemann had removed thousands of tons of debris from the hill of Hisarlik and was deeply disappointed by his unimpressive finds. So were the critics who cruelly remarked that Priam's palace would be more believable as Priam's pigsty. In the cold light of day, it did not fit Homer's story. Schliemann was also worried about his health in this pestilential plain, as he called it, where he suffered recurrent bouts of malaria and depression, with premonitions of death. The difficulties of making excavations in this wilderness are immense, he wrote, and increase day by day. My dear wife, though, is present from morning till night. He decided to call the whole thing off in mid-June 1873. And then, on May the 31st, came a twist of fate which Schliemann almost seemed to conjure out of nothing. It was, or so it appeared to Schliemann's suggestible mind, a gift from the gods. Schliemann claimed that he and Sophie had found a stone-lined chamber in the debris of the burned city. There, in a copper cauldron, were gold, silver, and bronze vessels, bronze lance heads, several thousand gold finger rings and earrings, bracelets and necklaces, and 2 splendid diadems, one of which comprised 16,000 pieces of gold. It was with this last that he later bedecked his wife Sophie. Could they not be the jewels of Helen herself? For the romantic Schliemann, past and present had momentarily merged. The past, Homer's past, had come to life.
Were the jewels really Helen's? Had they framed the face that launched 1,000 ships? And were the ashes heaped up around them really the debris of the Trojan War? No. They were not only too early, they were 1,000 years too early. Schliemann had been digging far too deep, and intelligent observers told him so at the time. Frank Calvert, for instance, brilliantly observed of him that he had a gap in his finds covering the very period he was looking for, the traditional period of the Trojan War. Schliemann, of course, reacted to such critics by calling them libelers and liars, but underneath he was perplexed. And the following year, when he published his finds, he included with them an enormous atlas of photographs, plans and maps. This is the copy that came to the John Rylands Library here in Manchester. And in it, he asks that my colleagues may perhaps explain to me all the things that I found obscure, because everything there appeared to me strange and mysterious.
But there is another question we should ask of Priam's treasure. Was it even genuine? for it is now widely believed that Schliemann somehow faked the find. Unfortunately, the treasure itself is no longer available as evidence. Early in 1945, as Berlin burned, it vanished. It has never been seen since, though it is rumoured to still survive in a private collection in the West.
Let's
But
hope
was it
so.
found? And was it found at Troy? Schliemann's own accounts contradict each other, and it's now known that Sophie was not present as he alleged. But in Cambridge University, Donald Easton, who has been examining Schliemann's dig notebooks, believes he has solved the mystery of Schliemann's discovery of Priam's gold.
I think he was a bit of a fantasy merchant in some ways. That comes out in some other aspects of his life, in his records of his travels, for instance, and that's been quite well documented.
Oh, hello,
To expect all
RTX Gamer 48.
some discrepancies
This is my
consistencies in the notebook of
VTuber
and so you shouldn't read
PNG.
too heavily on
Made it myself.
Now, as regards Priam's treasure, despite all the hoo-ha,
And given the general luck of it,
that it was found as a single haul.
there's a bit of dissonance, art style dissonance, but it's kind of like Harvest Moon in a way.
And it wasn't an abandoned treasure chest. It seems now that it was dug down into the deposits of Troy to.
So I get very much absorbed in this.
So these were grave goods that somebody deposited in perhaps Troy 3 or perhaps Troy 4.
So you defend him against his detractors then?
On this particular point, yes. It's clear that he simply didn't have the time to look at the treasure in any great detail. And therefore, if there are a few discrepancies or things omitted or wrongly described in that very brief and rather garbled account, it's not at all surprising, I think. But on the other hand, some of his interpretations on the grand scale were absolutely right, because, for instance, what he identified as prehistoric material, and which nobody else had come across before, is prehistoric material. He was perfectly right. What he identified as Mycenaean material is Mycenaean material. So on these very broad questions of interpretation, he could be dead right, and he stuck to his guns in the teeth of opposition. And of course he did have the one great scoop, which was that he actually found a late Bronze Age citadel in the right place, that is to say, underneath classical Ilion. And the reason he found that was that he had the guts, that he had the drive, and he had the money to get out there and dig.
Yes, indeed.
After the sensation of the Jewels of Helen, where would Schliemann dig now? With Homer as his guide, the answer was obvious. If all Homer was true, then Agamemnon and the Greek heroes who had sacked Troy must also be real people. Across the Aegean in Greece lay the fortress where legend said Agamemnon was buried, golden
Yes,
Mycenae.
indeed.
And to Mycenae, Schliemann turned next.
Yes, Mycenae, what am I saying? Heracles came from Thebes. I mean, his family's from the Mycenae
Unlike
region,
Troy,
but he was
the
born
site
in
of Mycenae
Thebes.
had never been forgotten. Its ruins still stood above ground and had been described by many earlier visitors. Here was a mysterious gate, still adorned with headless stone lions. Perhaps it was thought the badge of Agamemnon's family. Nearby were gigantic
The House of
tombs,
Atreus.
their superb vaulted roofs, the most tremendous monuments of the European Bronze Age. Since the ancient travel writer Pausanias, these extraordinary remains had intrigued all the searchers who had come to Mycenae looking for truth behind Homer's tale.
Yes, indeed. Nice shot. Oh, very nice shot.
I arrived here on the 7th of August 1876, wrote Schliemann, by the same road as Pausanias describes. The situation of Mycenae, he adds with typical enthusiasm, is beautifully described by Homer, deep in the depths of horse-feeding Argos. Like the many travellers who had visited Greece since its independence, Schliemann approached Mycenae as a pilgrim, in a mood of veneration.
So, any moment we'll be coming to the Mask of Agamemnon. How do I know this? Well, I have a fair familiarity with this.
On the night before he first set eyes on it, he slept on a wooden bench in a wretched inn pestered by mosquitoes, but oblivious to the discomfort as he contemplated the gigantic figures of the Greek heroes in this memorable place. Heroes who, murdering and murdered, were sacrificed to their inexorable fate. Now Schliemann would surpass his fellow romantics. At Mycenae, he would literally bring the Age of Heroes back to life.
Perhaps. I mean, it's debatable if he did.
Schliemann's theory was simple. The travel writer Pausanias said that Agamemnon and his murdered companions were buried within the walls. It was always assumed that he meant the outer walls of the lower city.
Murdered
But Schliemann
companions.
thought
Wasn't
they'd
he
be
the only
buried
one who was
inside
murdered?
the citadel itself. The
I
scholars,
can't
as
remember. I'm pretty
usual,
sure it's just
but in the
Clytemnestra.
autumn of 1876, he started a great trench.
I'm pretty
just
sure
inside
Clytemnestra
the
and
line,
what's
across
his
a
name only
terraced
killed
area
him.
which looked as if it had been
Might have to
leveled long ago.
double check.
Immediately, he came across a circle of standing stones. Inside it were what looked like the remains
And of course,
king's
here's my cat
carved
Alex.
with chariots
Come to
of
join
fighting
us.
men. He dug deeper and found the tops of 5 shafts sunk into the bedrock. At the
Excellent
bottom were
music.
some of the greatest finds ever made in archaeology. In those shafts were the remains of bronze-clad royalty from the heroic age. Men, women, and children. They were literally covered in gold.
So Schliemann found his treasure.
Here too were the first signs seen by modern man of a heroic world which might be reflected in Homer's Iliad. Studded swords like the one Hector gave to Ajax. A dagger blade inlaid with a seam showing tower shields like those described by Homer. There were wonderfully worked gold ornaments covering the head and chest. Extraordinary fingerings, exquisitely engraved.
For Schliemann, there was no doubt that he had discovered here in the shaft graves the world of Homer, the world of the Iliad. Everything fitted. Pausanias had said there were 5 graves, and Schliemann had found 5 graves. The legend had even required Cassandra's 2 babies to be buried with her, and Schliemann had found 2 infants, leafed in gold. But here in the 5th grave, as with the jewels of Helen at Troy,
No, wait, yeah,
Schliemann
Cassandra
found
was
what he
killed
had
also.
above all wished to find. There were 3 male bodies down there, with gilt war gear, gold adornments on their breasts, and gold masks. When the mask was lifted off the first one, the skull crumbled into dust. The same happened with the second one. But with the third one, when the mask was lifted, as Schliemann himself tells the story, The round face, with all its flesh, was wonderfully preserved underneath the ponderous golden mask. There was no trace of hair, but the eyes were perfectly visible, and the mouth was wide open owing to the great weight pressed upon it, revealing 32 beautiful teeth, which led the physicians who came to examine the body to believe that the man had died at the early age of 35.
Oh, that's so good.
Schliemann, so the story has it, picked up the mask and kissed it. And that evening he sent the king of Greece a telegram. I have gazed upon the face of Agamemnon.
Love that mask. It's one of the most famous in the world. If not the most famous.
Professor George Milanas, the modern excavator of Mycenae, shares his predecessor's faith in the Homeric tradition.
There's no doubt that the times do exist, that the things were there, that he found those graves, and everything else he does. I mean, all comes out of his faith, unique faith, in the historicity of Homer and of the ancient authority.
Do you actually believe that the Trojan War took place?
There's no doubt about it in my mind. I lived in this hills there, and I've been looking at those stones for almost a quarter of a century. They say that it might be a sort of a myth, that all the long years of siege is something impossible. Well, I wanted to look at those walls from a point outside and think of these stone walls averaging a thickness of 14 feet. And imagine an army that's not equipped with guns, but people equipped only with swords made of bronze or bows and arrows. How could they cope to carry a place like that? The only way they could take this place was by long siege that would deprive water and supplies of those people. And that's exactly what happened in Troy. Troy was a fortified city, not perhaps a strong wall, but still wall. You could only capture it by a siege.
So do you believe that a king called Agamemnon took a force from here and went there?
Absolutely. Agamemnon is my long-lost relative. I believe that sometimes I come by myself during the night and converse with you. As a matter of fact, it's a marvelous feeling to have this feeling again of certainty that those things that you are around had life once upon a time.
Yeah, thank you for not stuffing on the keyboard, Alex.
Was the man behind the mask really Agamemnon? Again, alas. No. We can't even be sure that he was Greek. But the graves didn't date from the same time. They'd been added to over the best part of a century. And there weren't even 5. A 6th turned up almost as soon as Schliemann stopped digging. And the date was obvious to those experts who were studying the styles of pottery. It was 200 or 300 years before the traditional date of the Trojan War, let's say about 1500 BC. But for Schliemann, the most disturbing fact was that in all these wonderful finds, there was nothing to connect with Troy. And that was what drove him back to Troy in 1878, in 1879, in 81 and 82, still full of doubts, trekking around the Troad, even looking for a possible other site for Troy. But to no avail. And in fact, his next triumph turned out to be back on the mainland. And it was in the company of a man who really revolutionized Schliemann's ideas about archaeology.
Mycenae is technically on the mainland, isn't it?
For an architect's eye. His name was Wilhelm Dörpfeld.
Dirkfeld will turn out to be a key figure in our search. A 30-year-old architect, he complemented Schliemann's brilliant eye for objects with an uncanny ability to untangle building structures. In 1884, the two of them set out for a site famous in Homer's tale of Troy, Tiryns of the Great Walls, the Fortress of Hercules.
Not exactly accurate. Heracles had served its king Eurystheus as a part of his part of the 12 labors, but he wasn't actually a he wasn't actually a inhabitant. He wasn't actually a citizen. Whichever way you want to look at it.
From here, says the Iliad, King Diomedes led 80 black ships to Troy.
Diomedes, he who wounded Apollo. No, wait, not Apollo, Aphrodite. What did I say? Apollo first. Apollo was present in that scene, but it wasn't Aphrodite. Oh, jeez, I'm getting ahead of myself. He also wounded Ares.
Palace civilization, which had existed in around 1300 BC. The date he and Dirkfeld established from numerous finds of what was now known to be Bronze Age Mycenaean pottery. They were found in the ruins of a prehistoric palace on the top of Tiryns. There too were fragments of wall paintings from the heroic age. For the first time, the modern world looked on the faces of men and women who had lived at the time of the Trojan War.
Hadley, though, is this going to be another too early or too late?
The age of the heroes had come alive. With his digs at Mycenae and then Tiryns, Schliemann had proved that however distantly, the world of Homer reflected a world that had actually existed, and that the places Homer says were important were indeed, no matter how insignificant they'd been in later times. And Schliemann followed up this hunch, still using Homer as his guidebook. He looked in vain for the palace of old King Nestor at Pylos, for the palace of Helen herself at Sparta. Most of all, he hoped to find clues to the origin of his Mycenaean civilization. And there he looked to Crete, and to a site already exposed at Knossos, where he hoped even writing might be found. But to his great disappointment, he was unable to buy the site. But in all this, the central riddle of his career remained. Where was the Trojan War? The more he found on the mainland, the less his tiny little Troy too, seemed to fit. There was no resemblance of material culture, and in particular no trace of the pottery that he now knew to be Mycenaean. And so the quest that had been engendered in the mind of the 7 or 8-year-old child, as he said it, still confronted the 67-year-old man.
I guess Alex doesn't want to cuddle anymore.
In March 1890, Schliemann headed back to Hisarlik for the 12th time in 20 years. The riddle still gnawing at him. As he went over his excavation notes, something didn't fit.
What?
And now he took a different tack. He chose to dig outside the area he had ransacked, outside what he had said for so long was Homer's Troy. Why?
Are we going to get an answer?
Had he perhaps racked his brains back to those early destructive days when he had demolished fine limestone walls along the north of Hisarlik?
Come on.
Whatever the reason, to the end the old man remained a searcher. I wish I could prove Homer to have been an eyewitness of the Trojan War, he wrote. But I cannot. But had Troy been merely this small fortified place, A few hundred men would have sufficed to take it, and Homer's story would be exposed as a total fiction. Was that the truth of his long and costly obsession? Had the city only ever existed in the poet's imagination?
It was then that Schliemann made perhaps the most important discovery that he ever made here at Troy. It wasn't
Yes.
gold or treasure or anything dramatic, but it gave him the connection that he'd been searching for so long. The connection between the world he'd uncovered here at Troy and the world he discovered in Greece at Mycenae.
Mm.
And he found it, not within the city, but 25
Where?
yards outside the walls of what he thought was Homer's Troy.
25. Oh yes, what did he find?
Here, Schliemann and Dirkfeld uncovered at an unexpectedly high level, unexpected because for Schliemann everything ancient had to be deep, a
Oh,
house,
of course.
a grand house, which immediately, in their eyes, resembled the royal palace that they discovered at Tiryns. And better still, inside it were masses of Mycenaean pottery, exactly the kind they had found at Mycenae and Tiryns. The key in the dating of this search for them, just as they are for us today.
What is that?
In its quiet way, this was a shattering revelation, because it meant that the Troy that Schliemann thought was Homer's dated from 1,000 years before this, and that the Troy with Mycenaean contacts, which, if any Troy was to be Homer's, this would be, was somewhere outside it and undiscovered.
What a blow that must have been to the old man. He knew now that he'd destroyed much of the evidence, not just for himself, but forever. But he resolved to go back once again the following year, hoping he could still solve the riddle. It is not too late, he wrote.
Let me guess, he died the following year. Or a little bit after.
But the gods, as he would have said, did not allow it. On Christmas Day, 1890, he died in Naples, worn out by Troy itself.
Knew
He
it.
was taken back to his beloved Athens, his adopted home, for burial. Schliemann's tomb lies in the first cemetery of Athens, adorned with sculpted scenes of the heroes Hector and Achilles fighting in front of sacred Ilios. Alongside them in death, that latter-day hero Schliemann himself, Homer in hand, Sophia
Interesting.
devoted by his side, together conquering new worlds for the imagination.
That's nice. Very nice. Maybe he still is in the afterlife. What the? Were those swastikas? Good lord.
Schliemann's house still stands in Athens. His ghost is still there too. To make my beloved Greece live again, he said, all I did was to that end. The new science of archaeology did not escape such feelings. How could it? In a sense, it is the most romantic of sciences, for we would have it physically restore to us the lost past.
A lot of the past is lost, and it's always up to us to restore it.
My work, he wrote, will remain as long as there are admirers of Homer in the world, nay, as long as this globe will be inhabited by men. Know yourself. had the Trojan War ever happened? In the next stage of the search, we will see how Schliemann's successors, more scientific but no less romantic than he, tried to prove that Homer's tale was, after all, the truth.
BBC wishes to. Oh God. Oh God. They're gonna block this, aren't they? Oh, wait. Hold on. Wait a minute. Let me check something. In search of the Trojan War. Let's see here. 9 years. Okay, if they haven't gone ahead blocking that in specific countries, then they're definitely not gonna block this. Anyway, that's all for today. I'll see you on Thursday for part 2.